Good evening, everyone, and thank you for your patience. I'm glad you got a chance to know what goes on behind the curtain at these kinds of events. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm Rabbi Levi Darby, and I serve as Director of Jewish Life at the Peninsula Jewish Community Center. And I'd like to welcome you to this first session of our series, Grappling with Race in America. In this session, we'll explore the history of the policies and politics and the history from Reconstruction till today to understand how the experiences of today have been shaped by past history. This program is presented by the PJCC and the synagogues of the North Peninsula to enable our community to grapple with the realities of racism and injustice and to engage in open and honest conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the community. I am immensely grateful to the rabbis of our congregations for their collegiality and partnership in creating this program. I also want to express our community's thanks to the Jewish Community Federation and Endowment Fund, whose generous funding made this program possible. This series is presented in conjunction with the Jewish Community Relations Council, whose mission is to educate and advocate on issues of vital importance to the organized Jewish community based on consensus, civility, and an expanded commitment to living Jewish values of social justice. I especially want to thank Jessica Trubowitz, Public Policy and Community Building Director of the JCRC, whose guidance in planning this series has been invaluable. Tonight's program and the following two sessions are designed as webinars, so only the speakers will be visible. You will not see each other in the audience, and you will not be able to be heard. If you do have questions, and we hope that you will actively participate in the program by formulating questions, please put your question in the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. There's a chat box. Don't use the chat box. For questions, please use the Q&A box. You can type in the Q&A box just like you would type in the chat. And our speaker will answer as many of your questions as time permits. And please be aware that we are recording this presentation and it will be made available approximately 4 or 5 days after the session on the PJCC website. And now I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Peniel Joseph, our speaker for this evening. Dr. Joseph holds a joint professorship appointment at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and the History Department in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also the founding director of the School Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. His career focus has been on Black Power studies, which encompasses interdisciplinary fields such as African studies, law and society, women's and ethnic studies, and political science. In addition to being a frequent commentator on issues of race, democracy, and civil rights, Dr. Joseph's most recent book is The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. He also wrote the award-winning books Waiting Till Midnight Hour, A Narrative History of Black Power in America, and Dark Days, Bright Nights, From Black Power to Barack Obama. His book Stokely, A Life, has been called a definitive biography of Stokely Carmichael, the man who popularized the phrase Black Power. Included among Joseph's other book credits is the editing of the Black Power movement, Rethinking the Civil Rights Black Power Era, and Neighborhood Rebels, Black Power at the Local Level. And friends, I want to encourage you, if you are interested in learning more about the history of this period and the history of Black involvement in politics and Black power, I really want to encourage you to find your way to Dr. Joseph's books, especially the new one on Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., because it will really open up this history to you in a very meaningful and powerful way. And now, Dr. Joseph, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. It's all yours.
Thank you. Um, I want to start by thanking Rabbi Derby and Jessica and everybody who uh, helped to organize this event. Historically, we've had real coalitions between the African American community and the Jewish community. In a lot of ways, in recent times, that has been resuscitated since the tragic death of George Floyd. Probably in the biggest way has been the Senate runoff in Georgia, which resulted in the January 5th, 2021 election of Reverend Raphael Warnock, who is the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. Rabbi Derby, can you mute your mute your yeah, because I can hear it. Thank you. Can everybody mute? Reverend Raphael Warnock, who became the first Black senator elected from the state of Georgia in American history, but also 33-year-old John Ossoff, Jewish American and progressive. And Ossoff won in large part because Warnock really did a coalition to have Warnock voters become Ossoff voters. He said that Ossoff was his brother from another mother. So it's really heartening to see, especially since the 1960s. There's been a lot of times more division than coalitions between Blacks and Jews for a number of different reasons that we can get into in the Q&A. But it's definitely a hopeful sign for the future. I'll start by saying, right now I'm working on a new book on the period from 2008 to 2021, and really defining that as America's third Reconstruction, and that we're living in the midst of, and I could talk about that more in the Q&A. But I want to talk about the first and really the second Reconstruction all the way up to the present. The second really as the Civil Rights Movement, and not just the heroic period of the Civil Rights Movement from 1954 to 1968, but really a movement for racial justice and Black citizenship and Black dignity that starts during the Great Depression and during the Second World War, and that culminates in that Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power era as well. But the origin story here for now, within the context of today's talk, is really, I want to start with America's first Reconstruction. And when we think about that period, sometimes historians just look at it from the presidential perspective, 1865 to 1877. I really define that period of Reconstruction as really a more than 3 decades long struggle between 1865 and the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolishes racial slavery, all the way up until the 1898 white riot in Wilmington, North Carolina, which really ends the last interracial Reconstruction government. By 1901, George C. White becomes the last Black congressperson, House of Representative, elected to the South for the next almost 70 years from the South because of the success of Jim Crow and the resurgence of white supremacy. But when we think about Reconstruction, Reconstruction was in the aftermath of the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, where over 700,000 Americans perished. And remember, that war is really about racial slavery. Sometimes people say it's a sectional conflict. It's about states' rights. It's about anything else but the country's original sin of racial slavery. But the Civil War is fought over racial slavery. People might try to define the core reason for why the conflict occurs, and says it's because of states not wanting federal encroachment on their sovereignty. But it's really states not wanting federal encroachment on their sovereignty to have and to own Black people as human beings, as this species of property in perpetuity forever and ever. So that's why the Civil War is fought. It's important for us to not to keep our eyes on the prize and to not be distracted by arguments to the contrary in that context, as it's going to be important when we get to the present. In the aftermath of the Civil War, Reconstruction is really the literal and figurative attempt to redefine American citizenship and American democracy. When we think about the literal aspect of Reconstruction, parts of the Confederacy and even parts of the North have really lost infrastructure. Obviously, parts of Atlanta were burned. New Orleans was sacked. So part of this is a literal reconstruction, but a large part of it is really rethinking American democracy and whether or not American democracy is going to guarantee Black dignity and Black citizenship. So when we think about the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, what's really extraordinary is that the 13th Amendment is going to both end racial slavery, but also with a caveat. It's going to end racial slavery except for those who are incarcerated. And really immediately after the passage of the 13th Amendment, we're going to see different local efforts, at times violent, to circumscribe or marginalize newly freed African Americans. Remember, it's important to remember too that 180,000 Black men served as soldiers in the Civil War. Black women served as nurses and were part of the war effort as well. So Black people's freedom was earned in that sense and not something that was given, of course. But when we think about that period of 1865 to 1870, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments are really important. 14th Amendment is birthright citizenship in 1868. The 15th Amendment is ratified in 1870, and that's going to provide African-American men with voting rights. There was an effort, including by supporters of feminism like Frederick Douglass, the great African-American abolitionist, to have all women included in the vote. They weren't able to get Congress to pass that, and that's going to start a rupture between really white feminists and the Black freedom struggle, certainly white and Black feminists, a rupture between them. But the idea that Black men were going to get the right to vote before white women really is going to enrage Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and other people who had been for civil rights for Black people, for abolition until that happened. And we can talk about what that means for the present. But what's important is that when we look at the period from 1865 all the way to 1898, what we see is a couple of things. The positive is efforts to institutionalize and guarantee Black citizenship that are coming from African Americans themselves. This is not the federal government and the Freedmen's Bureau. This is Black folks who are organizing churches, historically Black colleges and schools, public schools. They're electing their own officials, and not just to Congress, but locally. There's going to be over 1,400 Black men elected to office in the first decade and a half after the ratification of the 15th Amendment. So it's important to remember the political self-determination of Black people during the period of Reconstruction. That's going to be leavened, however, by racial violence, anti-Black violence, and really these racial pogroms against Black people, including in my new home state of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina. And that's going to be racial violence to marginalize and end Black voting power, but also economic power. Black people are going to try to buy land. They're going to try to form farm cooperatives. They're going to try to do everything they can do to reunite with family and kinfolk who have been separated because of racial slavery. So when we think about that period of Reconstruction, it really is America's first attempt to have multiracial democracy, interracial democracy. And it's really quite remarkable because the Black folks who are going to be elected to the House of Representatives are going to do things like push for the radical Reconstruction that allows America to build its first public schools, first kind of anti-poverty and social welfare programs, infrastructure in the South and the North. So it's really quite progressive, but they're going to face all kinds of racial backlash during those 3 decades. So there's really never going to be, sometimes people make the claim, radical Reconstruction after the impeachment of Andrew Johnson is a high point, but there's really going to be highs and lows. Certain states like Texas, their Reconstruction experiments are only going to last a couple of years before institutionalization of Black codes, before institutionalization of poll taxes and Jim Crow violence, and also convict lease system. Reconstruction provides us the context, the origin story of mass incarceration, the cash money bail system, racial profiling, and really the incarceration, punishment, demonization, and dehumanization of Black bodies, both Black women, men, and children in the aftermath of the Civil War is really during Reconstruction. There's going to be 4 million newly freed African Americans. There's going to be about 500,000 African Americans who were free people before the Civil War. Really, actually, more lived in the South than the North, about 276,000 to about 230,000 in the North. And we're going to see certainly this Black elite that can read, that can write, that at times has stunning successes. And it's not just Frederick Douglass, it's the Ida B. Wellses, it's the Mary Church Terrells, and Anna Julia Cooper, so many different folks that we may have heard of. But when we think about the impact during this Reconstruction period, that impact is going to be both profound, but also illusory. The profundity is in the way in which Blacks are going to reimagine American democracy and think of 1865, both Juneteenth, but from onward as a new birth of American freedom. And so this idea that America is a place where all things are possible, the people who've been the biggest believers and the most profound architects of American democracy have been African Americans. And during Reconstruction, we see that in multiple ways. But we're going to see very quickly there's going to be racial fatigue on the side of both Northern whites and really a wish for vengeance on the side of Southern whites. And so when we think about the reason why I said historians usually look at 1865 to 1877 as a very specific period is because after 1877, Northern Union troops are withdrawn from the South. Initially, after the Civil War, the Confederacy, the old Confederacy, is divided into 5 military zones. And the price for readmission into the Union is going to be every state has to do new state conventions that allow Blacks and whites to vote. And once you have the Black vote, the Republican Party really becomes dominant in states where Reconstruction works. So the idea, and this is really connected to now with voter suppression that we see coming from the Republican Party, in this historical context, the parties are switched. They've realigned since Lyndon Johnson signed the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But in that historical context, it's really Democrats who are the QAnon and the conspiracy theorists and the prevaricators and the liars and those who are committing treason against the very idea that the United States of America represents, and who are the race baiters and the race dividers and the white nationalists and the white supremacists. And so what's extraordinary about the period of Reconstruction is that if democracy had been allowed to flourish, we would have had Black governors, and we had a couple of Black senators, PBS Pinchback and Hiram Revels, Mississippi, just for a short time. And this is before the Senate was elected through the popular vote. But we would have had a much different America if Reconstruction had been allowed to succeed and flourish. We wouldn't have had not just Jim Crow segregation, but the extraordinary wealth gap. One of the things that we see is that in the aftermath of racial slavery, Black folks had been promised 40 acres and a mule, and that had even, there had been an experiment, Port Royal experiment, South Carolina, where Blacks were given small tracts of land. General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, had promised even more. And that's going to be thwarted in the aftermath of Abraham Lincoln's assassination in April 1865. Andrew Johnson from Tennessee, even though he had been Lincoln's vice president and had said that he was against the secessionists, he really becomes an apologist for white supremacy. Obviously, Johnson is the first American president who's impeached. He's going to be unsuccessfully impeached by just one vote in the Senate. But from 1868, after his impeachment, all the way to the 2 terms of Ulysses S. Grant, we're going to see what people call radical Reconstruction, which is the Reconstruction Acts and the enforcement acts that are passed by a Republican Congress led by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner and other abolitionists. But it's going to be hard to enforce those things. It's going to be very, very hard. So we're going to see, sometimes people think about the lynchings that happened during Reconstruction, and we should. And certainly Bryan Stevenson has the memorial. 6,500 people were lynched, mostly Black, between 1870 and 1935. But there's really going to be over 50,000 Black people who are murdered by white supremacists between the end of the Civil War and the end of the century. And folks like Robert Smalls, who's the formerly enslaved African-American who becomes a spy for the Union and a military hero, they talk very poignantly about the number of Black people who go missing, who were the leading men and women, colored women and men of that time, and colored in quotes here, using the vernacular of the late 19th century and sort of capitalizing Negro. So when we think about that period from 1865 to 1900, what we see is alongside of Reconstruction is this period of redemption, or the Redeemer South. And the Redeemer South is really this idea of the lost cause, this idea, when we think about America's first conspiracy theory around race, certainly it was during the period of antebellum slavery, and the idea that there would be slave insurrections, whether it was Nat Turner or Gabriel Prosser or others, Denmark Vesey, that were going to upturn the entire South and the entire system of slavery, aided and abetted by white abolitionists. The biggest is really this lost cause. The lost cause is going to be a kind of revisionist history that the country is still facing today. And that revisionist history basically is based on this big lie that the Civil War was not fought over slavery, and that during those 12 years, initial 12 years of Reconstruction, that Black people sort of ran wild in the United States. They were murdering and raping people, and the Confederacy is forced to defend white lives through the Ku Klux Klan, right? And so this idea of the lost cause, that Robert E. Lee is this chivalrous hero, the idea that racial slavery hadn't been that bad at all, it had been an honorable system. The idea that once freedom came, Black people were somehow intellectually and culturally unprepared for freedom, is this magnificent lie. And when we see the aftermath of Reconstruction, what we see is that the North wins the Civil War, but the South wins the peace. And the lost cause becomes so powerful that it becomes really part of the ideology of the entire United States, not just regionally. So it's not something that's just imbibed by the William Faulkners. John F. Kennedy is getting lost cause history at Harvard University in the 1930s. The so-called Dunning School of Reconstruction history is the same kind of racist lies that Birth of a Nation, Gone with the Wind, Thomas Dixon's Klansmen is based on. And when we think about moving away from Reconstruction, the early 20th century, we're going to see Jim Crow racial segregation become further embedded in the very fabric of American democracy. Very quickly, even though there's going to be civil rights acts passed, 1875, enforcement acts, that is not going to be enforced at the local level. Black people are going to have to both defend their own lives at the local level against white supremacists. They're going to be forced, the convict lease system means that any Black person who does not have a labor contract with a white plantation owner can be absconded with by the justice system. Any white person can really deputize themselves to arrest a Black person for vagrancy, so-called quality of life crimes. Those Black people are going to be then basically sold off to private corporations who pay a fee per convict. So when we think about the convict lease system and the fact that until recently, a state like Florida still disallowed felons from voting. So you had your voting rights taken forever. Those are Reconstruction era white supremacist laws that circumvent the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. That's what they were designed to do. And certainly the Supreme Court in the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896 says 8-1 that separate but equal is constitutional. And that's not going to be really repudiated at that high level until 1954 with the Brown decision. So my final word on Reconstruction before moving forward is that the Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898 is really important because this shows you how Reconstruction really fails. The duly elected Black, white legislators are going to be driven out physically of North Carolina under the threat of death, and that government's going to collapse. So anti-republicanism in North Carolina and in the South during Reconstruction is really at the end of a bayonet and at the end of a gunshot barrel. So that's how white supremacy works. Yes, there's economic marginalization. Black people are forced to be sharecroppers. They're forced into peonage, convict lease system. Even before the Great Migration of the early 20th century, there's a migration out west to places like Kansas and other places to try to escape the moral reprehensible nature of the South, the politically indefensible nature of the South, and really the betrayal of American democracy by both Southern whites and Northern whites, by presidents, by senators, by governors, by politicians. And the fact that the white supremacists who headed the Confederacy are not held accountable means that they their assets and their lands and their wealth is never liquidated. It's never redistributed. The same folks who fought on the side of the Confederacy to destroy the United States of America become plantation owners and senators and governors in Mississippi, South Carolina, Texas, and other places. And so it's really a remarkable tragedy that the country has still never recovered from. And when we think about the early 20th century, very quickly, the Great Migration is going to really transform the United States. And Isabel Wilkerson, even before her brilliant book Caste, has a wonderful book called The Warmth of Other Suns. And that migration is to places like New York, Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh from the South, Los Angeles, Oakland, Ohio, all sorts of places Black people go to. But what they find when they go to these places is, yes, they build communities in Harlem, they build communities in Chicago's Bronzeville, they build communities all over that are going to have art and culture and intellect. They're going to build businesses, but they're going to encounter huge racial violence, anti-Black violence, because they're going to be perceived as labor competition, just as they were perceived as labor competition against free white labor during antebellum slavery. And then after, they're going to be perceived the same way when we think about Ford Motor Company and Black people working for the Ford Motor Company. They're going to get the lowest, meanest, dirtiest jobs. They're going to be marginalized from unions. And there's really going to be a series of racial pogroms against African Americans. 1906, Atlanta, 1919, Chicago, East St. Louis. Of course, Tulsa, Oklahoma, in May of 1921 is the most infamous. Rosewood, Florida, Elaine, Arkansas. And these are all places where that lie of the lost cause continues to be used as a rationalization to destroy Black life. So this sort of destiny into premature death, systems of incarceration and containment and control, when we see the rise of the carceral state in the early 20th century, this is all happening post-Reconstruction. So Reconstruction allows the perpetual marginalization and the demonization and the dehumanization of Black people, but it also allows for their super exploitation in the context of labor and racial capitalism. And when we think about that term, racial capitalism, it's really a term that the historian Cedric Robinson came up with in 1983. And it's a term that really describes the way in which at least in the context of the United States, capitalism has not worked as a merit system. It has not worked as a system that is about competitive forces and let the chips fall where they may. If anything, it's worked in a highly racialized fashion where the labor value is perpetually extracted from Black people in ways that are violent, that are punishing, and that disallow them to enjoy the fruits of their own labor. That goes from sharecropping, from field, but also to factory. When we think about the Great Migration, convict lease continues in the early 20th century. Douglas Blackman has the extraordinary Pulitzer Prize-winning book "Slavery by Another Name," which really is a brilliant book on the convict lease system and Black people, even in the early 20th century, continuing to be underneath the yoke of that system unjustly, really illegally and immorally. But that gives us a great entree into the creation of Black criminality and the criminalization of Black people that starts during racial slavery, continues into Reconstruction, and certainly continues into the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Now, very quickly, I want to talk about the second Reconstruction. We usually think about the civil rights movement as something that starts with Rosa Parks or the Brown decision, May 17th, 1954. Rosa Parks not getting up from her seat, December 1st, 1955. Martin Luther King Jr., Ella Baker and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, all these different organizations and activists and entities in the post-war period. When we think about that modern civil rights movement, that modern movement is really based on an earlier era. And that earlier era is the period of the 1930s and the 1940s, where alongside of the Great Depression, you have political radicalism, including Black Jewish alignments in the Communist Party, liberals, socialists, even small c conservatives, much different from neoconservatives and conservatives of the contemporary era, who are at times joining together and pushing for a reimagined capitalism. Remember, the New Deal is really two-tiered liberalism. It's a Jim Crow New Deal where Black folks are going to get access only to sky-rise ghetto housing apartments, where white folks are going to get access to 30-year low-interest mortgages, and the Levitt towns and the suburban tracts that are created in the 1940s and 50s. Black folks are not going to get access to the GI Bill on an equal basis. They don't get access to the alphabet city of the real alphabet soup of social programs the New Deal comes up with: Civilian Conservation Corps, Agricultural Adjustment Act. The way in which Black farmers are treated is one of the hugest national scandals of the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. So much land has been pilfered and stolen from Black farmers. Black farmers have never gotten access to subsidies of land. That's why so many of them were very disappointed when Tom Vilsack once again became Secretary of Agriculture, because the Agriculture Secretary has so much that they could do to provide equity. But really, historically in this country, the Secretary of Agriculture is there to really contain and make sure that the politics of white supremacy continue to flourish vis-a-vis those resources in American farmland. So that's something that's very important. So when we think about the 1930s and the 1940s, we start to see this movement. We start to see people like Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois. We see Mary Bethune-Cook and the young Ella Baker, and that movement for a double V campaign: victory against fascism abroad and victory against anti-Black racism and Jim Crow in the United States. And all throughout the war years, there again becomes these, they call them race riots, but they're really racial anti-Black pogroms. Detroit, Los Angeles, Harlem, other places, competition over jobs, competition at times over social spaces, competition at times for over bodies. When we think about women and men engaged in interracial, whether it's friendships or romances or just congregating next to each other. So it's extraordinary when we think about the heroic period of the civil rights movement between 54 and 68. We a lot of times forget the even more at times radical nature of that civil rights movement in the 1940s. That's the 30-minute mark. I'm gonna continue for a few more minutes. And so when we think about that civil rights movement, we have to think about it as America's second Reconstruction between the 1930s all the way into the 1970s. So it's about another 30-year period if you think about it, from 1941, when A. Philip Randolph threatens the original March on Washington movement if Franklin Delano Roosevelt does not desegregate the defense industries, and Roosevelt signs that executive order, which is eventually going to lead to the creation of the Fair Employment Practices Committees. And they're not going to have much teeth, but they're going to really eventually lead to some major breakthroughs in the 1960s. When we think about the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s into the early 70s, this is an effort at America's second Reconstruction to redefine and reimagine American democracy from the bottom up and the top down. When we think about the parallels between these two Reconstructions, yes, there's a move for voting rights, but overall there's a move for radical Black citizenship and Black dignity. Malcolm X is going to define Black dignity as the end of world white supremacy. Dr. King is going to define citizenship as not just voting rights, but decent housing, a universal basic income, healthcare, food justice, and the elimination of both racial terror and state-sanctioned structural violence. And when we think about structural violence, that's what we've seen in the United States as we continue to move forward. In all three periods of Reconstruction, even after the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in the first Reconstruction, after the Brown decision and the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the 1968 Open Housing or Fair Housing Act, what we continue to see alongside of those is one, weak enforcement, two, backlash, but also violence. We see so much violence. It's not just the murder of Emmett Till and Dr. King and Malcolm X, but it's the violence, the structural violence against poor Black farmers. It's the structural violence against poor folks who are living in racially segregated ghettos that are also economically impoverished. And that structural violence means that they have much less access if anything goes wrong. I live in Texas, and here we faced a huge winter storm just a couple of weeks ago, and Black and brown communities, and certainly some poor white ones, were the ones that were going to be hit the hardest by those winter storms. Black and brown folks are the ones who are most likely to live in apartments and not houses, to live in neighborhoods that are older with less infrastructure, and quite frankly, to not have local officials be responsive to their needs in a crisis, to have local officials, whether it's law enforcement or even elected officials, look at them as some kind of threat that needs to be contained and marginalized, and not human beings who need to be rescued. So very, very quickly, coming up to this present, from the second Reconstruction all the way to the present in this third Reconstruction, what we have to understand is that even as we've seen the rise of the Oprah Winfrey's, Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, the Michael Jordans, what parallels that is this deeply entrenched racial and economic caste system that we have in the United States. And when we think about that caste system, that is rooted in racial slavery. We can think about it as a ladder with whites at the top and Black people at the bottom, and people of color in between, oscillating between both poles, but always trying to get access to that top pole, quite logically, because that top pole is connected to a supply chain of power and privilege, versus usually disproportionately for Black people, a supply chain of misery and grief. And what's so interesting about this caste system is that what people thought after Barack Obama was elected in 2008 was that somehow the election of Obama would destroy the caste system, where somehow one person's transcendent achievement, and certainly that was a watershed moment in American history, would end these structures and these systems of violence. It would eradicate systemic racism. It would eradicate white supremacy. And what we've seen is that in certain ways, it served as an amplification for those forces. This doesn't mean that, oh my gosh, we shouldn't elect a Black president or a female president. We've never elected a Jewish president. But what it does mean is that these forces of anti-Black racism, these forces of injustice have become amplified in certain ways. And some of that has to do with not just, of course, Obama, but just the resurgence of white supremacy and hate groups, both during the Obama administration, but also during the Trump administration. And this idea of MAGA and Make America Great Again was really this conception of racial division and the politics of white supremacy and a time machine, saying to disgruntled contemporary whites that America could get back to the 1950s and a kind of racist patriarchy where white men with high school degrees or even who were high school dropouts could have extraordinary success. But what they're not telling you, the punchline is the success was not based on some kind of merit within the context of capitalism. It's really based on the competitive advantage that the United States had in the aftermath of the Second World War. And it's based on the largest infrastructure spending in American history happens during World War II. The spending that we do during the Second World War outstrips multiple times the spending that we did even during the height of the New Deal, right? And so there's no way to recreate that again unless you did something very, very radical. And what's so extraordinary is that this period that we're living through now, 2008 to 2021, has really, really been echoing the first Reconstruction. So on one hand, you've got these striking juxtaposition, the election of Barack Obama, but at the same time, the rise of the Tea Party, the rise of birtherism, and this idea, again, another conspiracy theory that the president was not born in the United States. And that is designed precisely to negate this idea of Black citizenship and dignity. It always comes back to that. Sometimes we make a claim where it's for racial justice. And even when the rabbi was saying diversity, equity, and inclusion, we've got to be very, very specific. We've got to talk about Black equality. We can't skirt the issue because the origin story, the original sin here, and it's not just me who's saying this. Martin Luther King Jr. understood this. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel understood this. I mean, he marched shoulder to shoulder with Dr. King. This idea of Black citizenship and Black dignity is unbelievably important if we're ever going to build that beloved community that Dr. King talked about. And so not only do you have Obama's election and then sort of the rise of backlash, but you also have the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013-14 after the perpetual murders of Black people by law enforcement, of Black people by vigilantes. And that goes back as well to the first Reconstruction and the second Reconstruction. So history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes, right? So the very fact that Black Lives Matter becomes as controversial as Black Power shows you the sick society that we're living in, where activists say Black Lives Matter and people push back that all lives matter or blue lives matter. And the same people who are saying this are the folks who were rioting and organized a white supremacist riot at the nation's capital on January 6th of this year, right? And that was designed to do what? To really eliminate the Black vote. This was not the first time that's happened, but it's been the biggest time in public view of the world. The whole world is watching is one of the slogans of the 1968 Chicago Democratic National Convention, the activists outside. And they said the whole world was watching in 1968 because Mayor Daley and the Chicago PD, historically, they're among the most brutal police departments in the United States. They have literally tortured Black folks. Everybody should check out my good friend Lawrence Ralph's excellent book, The Torture Letters. that really breaks down what happened in Chicago. So this is a real a nightmare that we're going through. And certainly Dr. King said he had a dream. Malcolm X said, "What's a dream to you is a nightmare to many of us." Malcolm always wanted to sober us up about the depth and breadth of white supremacy. Dr. King, in his last 3 years, certainly leading the Poor People's Campaign, coming out against the Vietnam War as this radical anti-imperialist, his critique of capitalism, anti-racism, anti-poverty, becomes this extraordinary revolutionary figure as well, even as he maintains his commitment to nonviolence. But what we've seen with Obama, the Tea Party and birther, BLM 1.0, Trump and Trumpism, because remember, Trump is certainly an icon of white supremacy. He's not the inventor of white supremacy. So he's not some boogeyman who created all this. This is connected to our collective shared deep history, which again, we are usually in collective denial about it. Even right now, the state of Georgia is trying to outlaw educators from using the term white supremacy, because white supremacists hate to hear people talk about white supremacy. The sure way to not be friends with a white supremacist is to call them what? A white supremacist. And so when we think about where we're at now, and then certainly 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, we really are connected back to this history that we refuse to confront, because James Baldwin talks about not everything that is confronted can be won successfully, but you can't face anything unless it's you can't confront anything unless you begin to face it in the first place. So we've not faced up to this history that I've been talking about. Very quickly, I want to close by looking at the 3 Wednesdays in January, and then January 5th as well. January 6th is the white supremacist assault on the nation's capital. We shouldn't use the term insurrection. Insurrection, there's enslaved Africans had insurrections. Insurrections are for people who are battling against injustice, not for people who are trying to end democracy and create some kind of authoritarian white supremacist neo-fascist regime, neo-confederacy. So that's one. 2, the reason why it's white supremacist is that the whole idea, the big lie of election fraud, honed in on places where Black folks were voting: Atlanta, Detroit, Milwaukee, and other places. This is not new. As soon as the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, there were white lies about voter fraud, white lies about election tampering, because they were going to lose those elections in places where Black and white Republicans outnumbered them. It's something called democracy, right? White supremacists have never believed in democracy, which is why we had the Civil War in the first place. So when you look at where we're at now, 81 million to 74 million, we're in massive, massive trouble. We are in massive, massive trouble. It's a 5-alarm fire. There's over 164 state bills designed to repress the Black and brown vote right now in the United States. The Supreme Court is going to be in agreement. Democracy is hanging by a thread right now, right? And so I'll close by saying this. January 6th is the white supremacist riot at the US Capitol. January 13th was the second impeachment of President Trump, the first time a president has been impeached twice on a single article of inciting insurrection, which we all saw. And then January 20th was the inauguration of not only President Biden, but the first Black and female and South Asian vice president in American history. And those are all extraordinary events. And certainly the Amanda Gorman poem, The Hill We Climb, and her remark about that being an American is not just an identity that you proudly proclaim, it's a past we step into and that we have to find out about. That's what I've been trying to talk about, is that past and how those disparate pieces all cohere to help better explain our collective trauma, our collective national trauma. But we shouldn't also forget January 5th. When we look at those 3 Wednesdays, we have to remember the Tuesday that preceded the white supremacist assault on the nation's capital, which was racist. It was anti-Semitic as well. Folks had all kinds of disrespectful anti-Jewish shirts alongside of the Confederate flag in the Capitol rotunda. So really a moral and political disgrace. Yet at the same time, when we look at the data, many Republicans feel that now the assault was some Black Lives Matter hoax. It was some conspiracy once again. So we're in deep trouble. But January 5th is a silver lining here, and that is another face of American democracy. American democracy has always been Janus-faced or two-faced. We saw this during the first Reconstruction and the second Reconstruction, where you have progress on the one hand, but then you have these real forces of racism and anti-Semitism and political reaction and violence on the other. And I think that continues in our own time, but these striking juxtapositions are really threatening to unravel the entire republic and the entire democratic experiment. Anybody who's serious and sober-minded and intelligent can see that we are in major trouble, and our institutions are failing us. They are in the process of failing and not thriving. So we are in trouble. We are in major trouble. Anybody who believes in the idea of America, anybody who believes in citizenship and democracy and in dignity and human rights and social justice for all people, you can see that we are in trouble. The hopeful sign, and we saw this January 5th in the election of Warnock and Ossoff, is that there is opportunity for another America, a multiracial, multicultural America, that instead of being imbibing anti-Black racism, imbibing anti-Semitism, being anti-LGBTQIA, against human rights, marginalizing and discriminating against poor people, against people of color, religiously discriminating against people, marginalizing and scapegoating immigrants. There is another America that really connects with what Dr. King called the beloved community. Dr. King described that beloved community as a community that was absent of racial injustice, absent of economic injustice, and that was one that not only transformed itself through laws and public policy, but also through what he described as a revolution of values, right? He said that militarism, racism, and materialism were the triple evils facing humanity. And right now, those evils have been exacerbated in our own time, right? So part of what we need to do in terms of organizing is really see how that change needs to happen politically, it needs to happen socially and culturally and legally and legislatively, but that change needs to happen within us. I mean, we are all on this, we all every day walk this moral tightrope, and we've lost so many values, and not the cheap values of who's sleeping with whom, but the higher value of do children matter, do poor people matter, do people who are mentally or physically non-able-bodied, do they matter? Yes, do Black lives matter? Jewish lives matter? All these different things, we've lost it right before our eyes, and we could see that we're sliding down this very slippery slope into oblivion. But that idea, the calling to build a beloved community, and that we can help organize that beloved community is hugely important, and that's what gives me hope. We have to have hope in the face of this kind of evil that we're experiencing, this kind of violence that we're experiencing, this kind of racism and upsurge and anti-Semitism that we're experiencing, in order to try to build that beloved community in our own time. Thank you.
Dr. Joseph, you've just given us a tremendous amount of information and so much to think about. Thank you so much for this presentation. Really, so very much to think about. There are some questions from our audience, and there are a couple of questions that are factual. We're looking for facts, and I'll begin with that. One is, if you might please explain what the lie of the lost cause is. What does that expression actually mean, and what does it refer to? And if you could also please explain what happened in Tulsa and Wilmington that was so important in the history of our country.
Yeah, the lie of the lost cause is basically not calling the Confederacy the evil that it was and still is. That's the big lie of the lost cause. The lie of the lost cause is that uh, the Confederacy was about honor, that the conflict that leads to over 700,000 people dying wasn't about slavery, it wasn't about race. The lie of the lost cause is this revisionist history that slavery was somehow fine, Black people were treated well, Blacks and whites got along. The lie of the lost cause is that that Confederate flag is not a symbol of evil and white supremacy and the death of hundreds of thousands of people, and the perpetual enslavement of folks, the rape of Black women, the rape of Black children, the premature death of those children, how they were considered this species of property, and people actually took out life insurances, life insurance on Black bodies. You can read The Price for Their Pound of Flesh by Dinah Ramey Berry. You can read Empire of Cotton by Sven Beckert. The Half Has Never Been Told by Ed Baptist. You can read Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. So yeah, that the lost cause is a huge, huge lie. And the very fact that you can have any state house, Mississippi and these folks resuscitate the Confederate battle flag after the Brown decision. It's really, really reprehensible. And part of the reason why, as a society, we're lost is the very fact that you can have that Confederate flag around even to this day, right? That's part of the reason why we're so lost, and people talk about it as pride and chivalry. Um, Wilmington and Tulsa are important just because of those are examples of white supremacist violence. In Wilmington, North Carolina, that violence is a mob that attacks duly elected white and Black political officials, where Reconstruction had still retained a place in North Carolina. North Carolina even had a Black representative as late as 1901, right? George White has this famous "A Negro's Farewell to Congress" because they know there's not going to be any more reps, because people have been run out of North Carolina, and those who stay can't vote, right? And then Tulsa's example of adding insult to injury, because the Greenwood section of Tulsa is a thriving section, hundreds of buildings. People called it the Black Wall Street. And whites were very, very jealous of Black people in their own segregated area, really creating this thriving city within the city. And they used this idea of a Black person bumping a white person as a pretext to bring a white mob. These, again, are domestic terrorists who they murdered over 300 Black people. And that's why I said it's a racist pogrom, over 300. They used a plane and dropped a bomb on the city of Tulsa, which is why it burned, right? So when we think about Tulsa, and there's some great books on Tulsa, and obviously two different recent cultural explorations of Tulsa were in the HBO show Watchmen with Regina King, which sort of riffed on Tulsa, and then Lovecraft Country, also riffs on Tulsa. So really just the last couple of years, I would say Tulsa, which, in May of this year will be the centennial of Tulsa. And certainly the outgoing president, to try to troll Black people, held a white supremacist rally in Tulsa as part of his campaign, because that's what he did. It's just a white supremacist rally. And part of us with nomenclature, and this is part of Jewish tradition as well, you've got to call anti-Semitism what it is when you see it, right? You can't just say and fudge. And so if people are calling for the killing and murdering of Jews, you've got to call them out on it. So if people are white supremacists who are anti-Black racists, and they're holding these rallies, you've got to call them out and say, hey, what you're doing in Tulsa, it's a white supremacist rally. So part of it, in terms of to save what is being lost, we have to be able to speak truth to power, even when people are tired of hearing us say this, because people, lots of ways, are always tired of Black people and Jewish people saying the truth about efforts to oppress them, right? And people are saying they don't want to hear it anymore. And the only way we can save ourselves is to say it and say, you know what? I respect that you're tired of hearing this, but we're going to speak truth to power and say it. Yes.
Yeah, and I think there's a very strong case to be made, and I think there'll be a question about this before we conclude this evening about the fact that anti-Semitism and anti-racist hatred are bedfellows. They're
Yes.
often
Yeah.
combined. They often appear in the same groups, and a group who feels one will often feel the other.
Absolutely.
There are two questions, Dr. Joseph, about voter suppression. Um, Asking from two different sides of the question, I think.
Mhm.
One is, why is it considered voter suppression to require some official state issued ID? Doesn't almost everybody need such an ID to fly in a plane or to cash a check? The other question
Oh, let
is,
me stop right there because that's a good one.
go
And so
ahead.
I don't forget the second one. Here's why it's racist. One, historically in America, there's been very, very little voter fraud in modern times. So because part of that is because we simply don't encourage people to vote. So there's really never conspiracy theories of never actual voting. There's conspiracy theories, but there's really never plots where people are going to try to fraud through mail or through any other. So that's one thing to say. But here's the thing. So in a place like Texas, after the Voting Rights Act was basically in the summer of 2013, the Shelby Holder decision was gutted and enforcement was ended, Section 5, pre-clearance. What Texas and many other states started to do, North Carolina, and one judge even said North Carolina was trying to do voter suppression against Black folks with surgical precision, right? Is what they did is do this. They say, we're not going to let any form of ID in Texas allow you to vote. So if they did, that would be something different, because you could say, well, if you're a student at Texas, University of Texas, you can't use your ID to prove that you're a student here, that you live in Texas and vote. But if you have a gun license, you can use it. Okay. So that's racist because it has a disparate impact. So when we think about racism, what racism really means, it's really not about intent. That is one part of racism, but it's about outcomes, right? So unless you are a eugenicist, and remember there was eugenics said that Jews were messed up, Black people were messed up, right? Unless
Yeah.
you're a eugenicist, you understand that not every single person has the same talent, but everybody has the same human potential to do as much for the talent that they have as possible. So if you start seeing disproportionality at times, whether it's good or bad, something's happening. So the reason why Black people tend to be overrepresented in negative social economic indicators, it's not because somehow Black people have something wrong with them biologically. It's not because there's some bad culture and a culture of poverty that Daniel Patrick Moynihan said. It's structural racism. The reason why Black people haven't been able to do what Jewish people did or immigrants did, we have a different history and relationship to this country and its structures. And so asking the question is fine, but educate yourself, because that sounds exceedingly ignorant or naive or just mendacious to ask that question. Okay? Now, part two.
Part two is, what do you see as the best way to counter the current efforts to disenfranchise the Black and brown vote?
We've got to raise money like Stacey Abrams did in Georgia. We've got to organize people. And really, we've got to organize people on behalf of what King called the beloved community. I think one of the reasons why Reverend Warnock was able to become a senator and John Ossoff was that, especially Reverend Warnock, he was talking about really human dignity. He was talking about basic human rights for all people in Georgia. He was talking about jobs. He was talking about poverty. He was talking about ending criminal injustice systems. He was talking about really bread and butter issues. So the way in which we can combat it, we're going to need huge resources. You know, you need organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, but you're also going to need to give people a vision and a hope for why voting matters, why that is one aspect of citizenship, and why their vote is why people are trying to suppress their vote and assault their vote. Especially, this is now 56 years in August since the passage of the Voting Rights Act, but really the Voting Rights Act only remained for 48 years intact, right? 48 years. And if anything, the Voting Rights Act grew. Barbara Jordan in 1975 co-sponsored a bill, the 7-year extension, that made Texas part of the Voting Rights Act. So when we think about a new John Lewis VRA, we should have a Voting Rights Act that protects people in all 50 states. And it's going to protect everyone. It doesn't just protect Black people and brown people. The Voting Rights Act protects all people. It's just that those folks are those who are being disproportionately targeted so that they don't vote. They're being disproportionately targeted so they don't vote.
And as you were speaking, another follow-up question. This one has to do with the Supreme Court. Why do you think that the current Supreme Court will support the numerous attempts to suppress the votes of people of color? Conservatives are not of necessity pro-white supremacist.
Well, the new conservatives are. I would actually disagree with you. I think the old conservatives, those old small c conservatives who are thinking about a smaller government, who are thinking about a restrained federal government, were at times doing so for purely political or ideological reasons. Even though I would argue that even that, having a smaller government usually is going to disproportionately impact negatively people of color. But I wouldn't say, oh, they were just uniformly racist. I would say that when we think about the new conservatives on the Supreme Court, including Clarence Thomas, you don't have to be white to be a white supremacist. Do I think that Justice Clarence Thomas is a white supremacist? Of course. His decisions and his legal reasoning around Black folks make that patently obvious. So, you know, Clarence Thomas, the new Justice Amy Coney Barrett, the Chief Justice was the architect of the Shelby Holder decision. And now that we don't have RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, we are really at a disadvantage, 6-3. And Mitch McConnell helped to steal an extra conservative jurist, because after Anthony Scalia passed away, Merrick Garland should have been approved. And so on the Supreme Court, the last 4 years until RBG's tragic passing, it should have been a 5-4 liberal court. And now with Justice Barrett, it would have resumed to 5-4 conservative. And that would have been fair, right? So we don't have, once you, as you know, or people should know, once you go into a process with bad faith, you no longer have a process. That's why you can only have a negotiation for peace or for justice or ceasefire if both parties enter into a negotiation with good faith, in good faith. If one side is not entering in good faith, you don't have a process that you can trust. You know, and that's what that goes for anything, not just what's going on in the Middle East. That goes for anything. The only way you can get to a compromise is if both sides come in with good faith, right? So when we think about what's happening right now, we've got 74 million people who voted for a white supremacist. We can try and disentangle and say, well, what does that mean? But one thing I'll say is that they all voted for a white supremacist, because I'm certain that Donald John Trump is a white supremacist. So there were 74 million people, for whatever reasons, we can say, well, we need 74 million interviews with them, voted for a white supremacist. That should be very distressing for all of us, not just Black people, but Jewish people, not just Jewish people, but Muslim people, anybody who is a person of goodwill and a person who believes in human rights, who believes in the good, the overall moral good, right? Not just God, but the overall moral good, should be incredibly anxious and stressed out about what's happening in our country now, and not suddenly relieved because of this last election result.
Thank you. And here again is another pointed question. Um, this is a question more or less about sociology and the sociology of the African American community. What do you feel has affected Black Americans more? I think that would be pretty clear. The two choices are Black caste system
Yeah.
or the impact of welfare and the rise of Black single mothers, the decline of marriage, um, the impact of the lack of Black fathers and father figures in the lives of their children,
Yeah.
the impact of Black on Black crime. So I'd be grateful if you could address this, but also unpack it in a way so that we can really get to the heart of it.
Yeah, the thing is, the big answer is really structures of systemic racism and the expropriation of Black wealth from Black people and Black communities to white communities. And that wealth has been expropriated since racial slavery, but also in the 155 years since racial slavery, right? And the way in which that wealth has been expropriated, and this is really important, and there's some great new books by this on this. William Darity and Kirsten Mullen have a great book called From Here to Equality about reparations for African Americans. There's great books. Derek Hamilton is a Black economist who's written great things on this. Jacova Williams. So there's a real literature on this, real scholarly literature and public literature on this. But when we think about the expropriation of Black labor, that continues. Even when we think about Ta-Nehisi Coates, the essay, The Case for Reparations, which looks at from basically around the Reconstruction to the present. So that's huge. And this is not just income gap, this is wealth gap. The biggest thing in Black communities is not debt to income ratio. It's the lack of wealth, not income, but wealth. And the reason why Black families have less wealth, they have, you would need reparations for every Black family of 800,000 to make up the wealth gap, and it'd be about 90% of white families, 800,000. So that's happening because of the caste system that is set up during racial slavery and perpetuated by violence afterwards. So what we do is do this, though. And even the suggestion of the question, you start focusing on behavior instead of the structures of violence that prevent equitable outcomes, that prevent Black folks from graduating from high school at the same parity with whites, that prevent Black people from having access to small business loans. Why is there disparities in Black children's rates of asthma? Why is there disparities in Black women and their maternal health outcomes, even those who make $200,000 a year or more? So the deep-seated systemic racism in structures of health and wealth, in structures of politics, economics, culture, beauty, art, high finance, the tech industry. It's a scandal, right? And again, just like I said to the person previously, you've got to educate yourself, because really that's not for intelligent people, that's not a substantive answer. So I'll be very pointed to substantive question. It's not a substantive question because you're focusing on a snapshot of behavior and trying to parrot the conservative tangled web of pathology. So this idea of pathologizing Black people is very easy. Historically, Jews have been pathologized too, where people said this is their behavior because they were Jewish. And so instead of talking about structures of economic violence based in anti-Semitism, you said, no, here's this behavior that I've seen this person do. And again, the reason why we say Black on Black crime and not white on white crime is because we're racist, okay? And that question in and of itself is a question from a white supremacist. Okay. So that I want to be very pointed and frank with you, right? Educate yourself. If you have aspirations to be an intelligent person, you need a lot of work to do. You've got a lot of work to do. All right. Yes.
So, during the course of your presentation, you talked a little bit about Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And we know that during the height of the civil rights movement, there were a whole variety of powerful Black voices and organizations offering visions and strategies, sometimes, maybe even often, um, contrary visions and strategies for how to move the cause of blacks forward. Are there different voices in the black community today, and that are offering different visions of how to move forward and different strategies, or what they hope will be achieved in the coming years, and how to get there?
Yeah, no, I think, yes, there's always a multiplicity of voices. I think people during this period have really converged around um, aspects of what Black Lives Matter has talked about, especially vis-a-vis its policy agenda. Because when you read the BLM policy agenda, it's connected to 50 other organizations and nonprofits, including venerable civil rights organizations. And it's really a strategy talking about ending the cash bail system, defunding the police by investing in Black communities, reimagining public safety. The idea that somehow we need to invest in massive systems of punishment against Black and Brown people absolutely goes straight back to Reconstruction. Illinois just ended the cash bail system, which is hugely important. But we have a whole ecosystem. There's 1 million people in the United States employed just connected to the prison system and the carceral state. So if we abolished prisons and had a different system and didn't have 2.2 million people in prison, 4.5 million people parole probation, over 500,000 just on drug offenses, and now whites are making millions of dollars legally on marijuana while Black people are languishing in prison. We have a lot of work to do in terms of these structures and these systems. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, we have a question about the relationship of the black community and the Jewish community in
Yeah.
terms of the civil rights movement and some of the history. The question that's being asked by a member of the audience is whether you have a view of Mark Dollinger's book, Black Power, Jewish Politics, which is about how Black-Jewish relationship evolved in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s.
Yes.
Um, we'd welcome to hear your view about the book,
You
but
know,
also on the history of.
yeah, I'll talk about the history because I have Mark's book. I haven't had a chance to dive into it deeply. I think the history is one that has been deep, has been at times usually positive. I think it's turning positive again, but it's been really, really fraught, especially since the late 60s and early 70s. Some of this is around politics of the Middle East and Israel and Palestine and Black and Jewish allies at times interpreting events that are going on there just differently through a different lens, and losing friendship and losing coalition through that. Some of it is competition, in the sense of when affirmative action comes in, there's at times in the 1970s cracks in the coalition, like what is this going to mean in terms of set asides and getting federal contracts, and are Black people going to get a leg up in capitalism, or does it mean they're just not going to be discriminated against? So there's real issues there. I think the positive, and even going back before the 1960s, there were many progressive Jews who were connected to the founding of the NAACP, connected to the civil rights movement of the early 20th century, Jewish abolitionists and newspaper and journalists, folks who invested in the Black community. in positive ways. Jews and Blacks who are part of not just the Communist Party, but just different, very sort of progressive left interracial organizing, including some Southern Jews at times with Southern Blacks. And certainly when we think about events like Freedom Summer, just when you anecdotally, when you're looking at who the volunteers were, a lot of Jewish students volunteered for Freedom Summer in Mississippi.
Yeah.
So Stokely Carmichael went to predominantly Jewish Bronx Science. And initially, Stokely is marching in pro-Israel marches in the 1950s. Certainly he becomes this Palestinian rights person, but it's very interesting. And Stokely can speak, Kwame Ture can speak Yiddish. So there was a real, especially the children who were baby boomers who might have known family who had experienced the Holocaust, family who had experienced loss. They absolutely identified with the civil rights movement. That being said, it's not been perfect. It's not been perfect. It's been imperfect. At times, you've had both Black and Jewish former allies just devolving into recriminations of accusations of Black anti-Semitism and Jewish anti-Black racism. And so I think for decades, in a lot of ways, the kind of path towards convergence has been stymied by those issues. But like I said, I think recently, I said really a great perhaps turning point is Warnock and Ossoff, who got together in a real tangible way. And for me, their eyes were on the prize instead of saying, hey, let's focus on what divides us, right? You know what I mean? So they're saying, hey, they both believe in voting rights. They both believe in, a living wage. They both believe in criminal justice reform, all these different things that I think that we can converge on. So I'm hoping that 2020 is going to mark a turning point. And I know since George Floyd, just my own dialogue with Jewish communities here in Texas and nationally has certainly been amped up. So I think there's also a renewed interest within the Jewish community in terms of not just social justice, but specifically eradicating anti-Black racism. And certainly with what we've seen, both the January 6th riot and these new efforts at voter suppression, the whole famous thing of, when they came for this person, I didn't speak. And when they came for me, no one was there to speak up for me. Like I said, I can't iterate this enough. We're in trouble, we're in deep, deep trouble. And that's not alarmist. I think for people like Rabbi Derby and those who've been around, if you've been just around the United States, we're in deep, deep trouble. We are in deep trouble. And so this would be the time to converge with each other in that wider cause for Black dignity and Black citizenship, and that connecting that to a larger human rights struggle where we resist anti-Semitism, we resist the denigration of anyone, both in policy, our politics, our conversation, our culture. Again, I mean, building the beloved community, Dr. King taught us, was going to be hard. He died, was assassinated trying to build the beloved community. So this is hard work, and it's the work of many, many generations. But I think we have this huge sacred obligation and responsibility, not burden, but obligation and responsibility to do the best that we can during this very pivotal moment, because people are going to be writing about this moment in history decades and centuries from now. We're going to have to answer, all of us, to our God, to whoever we believe in, about what were we doing during this moment, during these moments, and that's globally,
Yeah, and I would say, Dr. Joseph, that what you've just been saying is the underlying principle that has brought this program together for our community, the desire to create a dialogue, a conversation, to educate ourselves, and then create community conversations where we can actually have civil discourse around the issues and also act based on what we know to be true.
Yes.
is really important. We have time for one more quick question. Um, oh, by the way, I just want to read this to you because you probably haven't seen it. Um, from a wonderful member of our community. Thank you for your brilliant presentation. Your students are so lucky. Any chance you'd run for any political office?
Thank you. You're too kind. No, I'm not interested in running for political office. I think it's, President Obama once said, and I agree with him, that the highest calling we all have, and this is in the secular sense, so I'm not saying in a faith sense, but being part of this country is as citizens. So what I try to do is be as active a citizen as possible, and that includes, that's not just voting, that's volunteering, that's attending things at my daughter's school PTAs. Just like I'm whenever there's a meeting, I say yes. I'm there. I volunteer. So I'm very, very pleased with that, and I'm interested in our politics, immensely interested, not to run, but to be as active a citizen as possible, because I believe in democracy. I believe in the United States of America at its best, and that's a country that is a compassionate country. That's not just a great country, but a good country. When you think about the Martin Luther King Jr.'s and the Ella Bakers, and what we've seen, the Amanda Gormans, the Stacey Abrams, just so many different folks. We have to always keep our eyes on that prize, and that's what sustains us.
Yeah, that's beautifully said too. Thank you. And I think we're going to leave it here for this evening. There were a number of questions wanting you to think aloud about what everyone can do to make the situation better. And I
Oh
think
yeah,
you're just
very
giving you the message.
yeah, very quickly. Rabbi, everybody who's part of this community, and this is what's so powerful about the Jewish community as well, is faith-based community that has such a rich, powerful history, but also a deep commitment to social justice historically. Really, really profound. And I think we share that interest in terms of the Black community. Everyone here has supply chains of power and privilege versus misery and grief. And what you can do is amplify and invest in centering racial justice in every aspect of your personal and professional and religious life, both in the Jewish communities that you're a part of, but in other communities as well. So I'd say everybody here can be an agent of change, and to use the resources that you have, not just financial. It could be your personal font of wisdom. It could be your energy and enthusiasm for education or science, technology, and math, or high finance, or whatever you're interested in. You can be a huge change agent at your PTA, at your city council, at the synagogue, to not just have conversation, but real action. Well, think to yourself, where can I make a difference and amplify on behalf of others, Black, brown, other communities, amplify the powerful resources that I have. One of the things that Martin Luther King Jr. said was that vanity asked, is it popular? But conscience asked, is it right? Right. And he said there was always time to do what's right. And so I do think that there's a great change happening, right? There's a great awakening happening, and all of us can do and should be as active as possible. So some of it is, yes, educating ourselves. Some of it is conversation, but none of that's going to work unless we turn that education and conversation into action and agitation. And sometimes we're going to have to make people feel uncomfortable. I agree with Rabbi Derby. Civil conversations always. I love civil conversations, but they can be uncomfortable conversations. We have to push each other. We have to push each other and say, what kind of world can we imagine willing into being? Certainly non-violently, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to have disagreements. The only way we can come to compromise is that if we go into those conversations in good faith with each other. Right. That's why, because there has to be good faith, because that's the only way you can have trust in a process. It doesn't mean you get everything you want. It doesn't mean I get everything I want. But if I know that you've come into it with good faith, then when we meet whether that's a middle or a little bit more to you or a little bit more to me, I'm confident that I trust the process, right? And that's what we've lost as a country, and that what we're gonna need to regain. We're gonna need to regain faith in the process, and thereby faith in each other. But everybody here can be part of amplifying justice in myriad ways. People can check us out too, Rabbi, our CSRD. .lbj.edu and what the center that I run at the LBJ school. We do programs. We have students and fellowships. We do a lot of amplification of this same work. And right here in Texas, we've been working even more closely with the Jewish community than ever.
Dr. Joseph, we are truly, truly grateful to you for spending the time with us and for educating us with so much depth and with so much great guidance. Thank you very, very much.
Oh, it's been my honor. Thank you. Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for participating this evening with us. I want to make sure that you know that the series is going to continue next week. On Thursday evening at 7 p.m. If you are not registered, you can still register for the program next week. The title of the program is Perspectives on Criminal Justice Reform and Police Reform. Our presenter will be Director Paul Henderson. He is the director of the San Francisco Police Oversight Office, and he will be in a position to talk about not only the general issues of justice reform and police reform, but especially what's happening in our own community in the Bay Area. All you need to do is register and make sure that you attend. For those of you who would like a recording, you will find the video recording at pjcc.org. Within the next 4 or 5 days, give us some time to get the recording edited and put up on our website, but you'll find it there. And again, thanks to everyone for being together this evening. Our goal is indeed to educate ourselves, to engage in community conversation, and to go out into the world to do essentially what our Jewish tradition teaches us, just as Dr. Joseph has said, l'takeno olam b'malchut Shaddai, to repair our world, to make our world a better place through social justice and even politics. So thanks to all of you again. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thanks for being together. Dr. Joseph, thank you again.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.